Hi everyone, this is COVID with a K, your host at Beyond the Code podcast series by Typo. Today with us, we have an interesting, amazing guest from a really amazing place called Prague. He has 15 years of engineering leadership experience. He has been a former vice president at Mews. We would love to learn and hear your thoughts today, Marian. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kohit. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to run this show.
All right, Marian. So before we get started with the main section of how to use engineering metrics and how to have a data-driven mindset, I have a quick fireside chat to know you more. Okay.
Okay.
And you have to be like very comfortable. Share your real thing. Okay. We would love to know, our audience would love to know you. Are you ready for that?
I hope I'm ready.
No, it's going to be light. All right. So we'll start with the fireside chat. The first question. Which is your best memory from childhood about coding?
Coding. Yeah, thing is, like, I started coding at age 11 approximately, and it was not really like it was the oldest PCs, if you know what I mean. So by that time, if I wanted to play games, I had to, basically run it from the audio cassette. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is that the graphics was not really exceptional, but I was lucky to have some sort of coding book where I went through the tutorial step by step. And that was the first, enlightening of saying, this might be the right thing to do and to play with around. Yeah.
Great. I think starting to code that early would have been amazing, man. I think nobody at that point of time probably would have known much about it. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And the thing is, the computer was not really ours in my family. It was, my father's gift. He somehow moved it from his office to home sometimes, from time to time. And I was benefiting from that experience, right? And then I was really asking him hard way to bring the computer every single time after he's back from work, right? So, which wasn't really comfortable in the end.
So now you know how legends are born, right?
Yeah.
Great. Moving on to the next fun question. Now, this is my favorite. Which one's your favorite Netflix series and why?
There's a couple of them. To be open, I'm not really watching Netflix or, Disney anymore because I'm really strict when it comes to my schedule. Nevertheless, if I do have some time, last time I remember I was watching, I think it's called The Sandman. The Sandman is really something that I was really astonished to see because, the story is amazing. Plus, the graphics, that's something which really caught my eye. But nevertheless, the story about, the dreams and the way how to think of some, parallel universe, that's something what was really mind-blowing in my case.
Thanks for sharing that. I think we have got a few more to watch on Netflix now.
But I'm sure there's so many better series than this, but I'm already out of the current time. Yeah.
Perfect. Last question. How do you unwind your day?
When I'm usually finishing my day, I'm getting pretty tired, to be open and honest, because most of the time it's mostly advisory to specific companies or mentoring. And there is, by the way, one thing I found out, which is I can't handle more than, I would say, 3 to maximum 4 mentoring sessions a day, because it's as intense as handling interviews. And openly speaking, I'm just moving to my men's cage, if you know what I mean, and cry on my shoulders to preserve my energy. But openly speaking, I'm living in a cottage house, so what I love doing is really to go on a walk, around my garden. Plus, I'm a family person, so you know what it means, having the family and taking care of the kids and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, as I was saying, I desperately need all the time and each and every day to preserve some of my just private time in my cave for myself with no internet, nothing, just taking a rest and taking a deep breath, right? Yeah.
Thanks for sharing all this.
Yeah.
It was really, really nice knowing you more. Great. I think now it's time that we move on to the main section where we talk about how to maintain engineering efficiency with a data-driven and empathetic mindset. So this is I think very close to home to you also, because you have been a leadership coach and you have been posting a lot about such topics. So today I have a very, I would say, interesting as well as deep questioning here from you to actually
Mhm.
see how you lead engineering teams while you work with them. How do you
Yeah.
teach them that data-driven mindset and empathetic mindset to actually improve the efficiency? All
Yeah.
right, I think we're all set.
Yeah, we are good, and we're looking for the topic because I'm a data-driven person, to be open. So looking forward for the topics we have ahead of us.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll start with your experiences first. You have 15 plus years of coaching, being VP. I mean, diverse experience as an engineering leader. You would have seen a lot of challenges and you would have overcome them. So let's talk about something from your experience at Mews, probably. Anything that you would love to share with us? Any specific challenge? How did you overcome it?
Oh, okay. So putting a little bit more perspective into my last full-time gig, it was the story of Mews, where I was working as a VP of product engineering, and now I can say the story was pretty funny and interesting. Nevertheless, when I started at Mews, it was not that funny anymore because it was the COVID time with the C, not with the K, of course. So there was plenty of the layoffs, and let's say the atmosphere was not that great, I have to say. By
Yeah.
the time I was running around 8 to 10 teams, different product engineering teams, and after almost 3 years, I ended up with more than 30 teams in total. Right, so the experience was that after a couple of years from running, basically resurrecting, that's I would say the right word, the teams from sort of a poor efficiency into something meaningful, into something that the teams are really considered as an ammunition that can overcome and run over the competitors, basically. And that was what we were after. And in the end, we ended up being successful in Series C investment, which was around 200K, right? Pardon me, 200 million, right? Bit different number here. So that was really the story of Mews. Of course, it was not only my job. It was the job of other stakeholders, participants, other peers. I wouldn't be able to basically resurrect and grow the team just on my own. That being said, the important portion of that goes to, for example, product management and to other departments in the company. Plus, we had to change the culture and prepare the teams for the growth, right? So that was one of the things. So, roughly speaking, when it comes to the challenges, it was really, making sure that all the teams are aligned, because there were so many different initiatives that we were running. Plus, the focus was not there. I would dare saying that the teams were not really efficient in the end, right? Although we were busy, you know how it goes. The productivity was
Right.
not really there. And I was taught that, when I entered the company, I was told by the chief product officer that engineering is a black box, basically. That was the message. And so turning that into something that works, into something that's predictable, that's transparent, and I would say the keyword here is trust, to turn the teams to something that's trusted. That was really, one of the stories that we were after, and successfully we made it work this way. Yeah.
Okay. Did you do anything about solving the black box particularly? Like when it was told to you that it's going to be a black box. And
Yeah.
then, of course, when you are leading a team, you just don't want it to be a black box. You want to know a little in and out. Of course, things run on trust. That's totally there. And I totally believe that's the core of every
Yeah.
good team or a successful team. But still, were you comfortable with that thought, or did you do anything about it?
Well, of course, there were some sort of initiatives that, I made live. Openly speaking, I started my first 3 months doing some sort of an internal audit, meaning like, making sure that I understand, the foundation, I understand the product, I understand, when it comes to the teams, to their productivity and, all the different aspects of that, including leadership, of course. And the second thing is, after the audit, it was pretty clear to me what are the main, most valuable items or initiatives that I should be focused on. To be more specific, I started observing the teams, the way that I attended their different ceremonies. I was working closely with the product engineering side. One of the issues was, again, openly speaking, the cooperation between engineering and the product as such. And the second issue we were facing was transparency, meaning we wanted to make sure that engineering product are both transparent enough in terms of knowing where we are when it comes to ongoing initiatives, where we are when it comes to the backlog and what awaits us. So basically the purpose of that was to lower down the communication gap. And once again, the transparency is one of my principles that I'm sticking to quite well. That being said, I moved from spreading the gossips and the hypotheses about the gut feelings to the system that really worked through data and seeing how things work for us by inspecting certain things in reports, basically. I know it doesn't sound very attractive, but leading more than a dozen of different engineering teams, you don't have much of a choice because that would go to micromanaging the teams, which is not the right path to go, especially in case you want to scale the teams, right, and give them the ownership. Yeah. So basically, coming back to your question, I would say transparency is the keyword we are looking for. Yeah.
Well, that totally makes sense. Great. Thanks for sharing this. Moving on to my next question, which is kind of related to this when you talk about transparency and not micromanaging, right? I have seen different teams, different type of leaders, like ones who are purely data driven, right? Then there are teams where leaders are purely like intuition based. There are 40 developers working, but they are working on purely the intuition. What's the productivity? What's the output? How things are moving? So people are very intuition driven. And I'm not saying that it's wrong or right, but every situation demands a different balance of both. That's what I believe. What's your take on that? Like, you must have seen teams in the similar manner as I have seen. Some are data driven, some are purely intuition driven, some have a balance of both, right? So what's your take on that? I just wanted to hear it from you.
Yeah. Well, of course, it all depends. It depends on, what's the current stage of the company, whether that's a startup, the scale up, or I would say up to a corporate. The second thing is whether, the company as such is working on projects or products, if you know what I mean, right? That's a huge difference. The other differentiator might be whether the company is a stage of, sales-led versus product-led growth and, strategy. That's, by the way, really important because when you are sales-led, then you need some sort of a lead who's, giving you the direction and who's sort of also almost micromanaging things, which might be the right thing to do at the given time. Nevertheless, if you want to scale, then you should be slightly starting to move towards the product-led organization, right? What I was going to say, there are different aspects that might influence our decision process, how much I'm going to lean towards, the gut feeling and empathy versus data. Nevertheless, my message would be, if you are running more than 8 different teams, or I would say 6 to 8 different teams, then it might be the right time to verify your hypothesis and help the teams with the productivity through the data-driven approach, right? And that was really my path. And again, I stick firmly with my principle of transparency and providing these sort of, transparent reports with valid indicators, of course, is in my case the right way to go. And it always, sorry to use this word, it always saved my ass, right? So that's how I see it, right? On the other hand, when we have, gut feeling teams, if we may put it this way, what I see often, there is a big proportion of inertia and a big proportion of complaints and sort of inability to make the right decisions. To be very specific, what I mean is that, for example, if an agile coach tells me, we have an issue with a specific, let's say, with a velocity, with estimate, or with the quality of the product, or with the deployment frequency, or with the confidence when it comes to the sprint's completion, then it's not only to have this gut feeling, but also to look into the data. Because since the moment I'm showing some sort of trends based on the figures, then people start to listen to my arguments as opposed to say, okay, that's yet another hypothesis. And we heard already hundreds of similar hypotheses. So thank you for sharing your opinion, and let's move on to the next topic, right? So that's not something that is really helpful. And the way, for example, how I'm treating data is that, for example, I'm very specific when it comes to fixing or improving the teams. What I mean to say, for example, I'm really tightening improvements to specific measures. And here I may say, for example, when it comes to the sprint completion, to me, the healthy consideration of the team is I want to see that the teams deliver minimum 80% of the sprints, right? When it comes to the
Yeah.
roadmap contribution, I expect that the teams deliver or spend minimum 60%, for example, generally speaking, on the product roadmap, right? So there are different, let's say, thresholds or metrics that I'm using just for the sake of making sure that the teams is considered highly performing and healthy. And here I want to make some sort of a side note, which is often I see that each and every manager or owner of the company wants to have highly performing teams. You can have these sort of teams, but when you are throwing junk into the teams, then you get the junk out of the team, right? So it's not
Yeah.
only about having the highly performing teams, it's also really important to know what I'm asking these teams to accomplish, what's under their plate, what are the main initiatives, and whether these initiatives are the most valuable things that these teams can do, as opposed to doing something that goes to the shelf and not being touched by the customer, right? So that's something that
Right.
I see being neglected sometimes. Yeah, a bit often than I would wish.
I
Yeah,
think I personally have felt this, that this seems very right with
yeah,
scale. You have to have this kind of a mindset. You have to bring in that transparency. You have to be little data driven. In fact, not little more data driven than you think
yeah,
you should be. Uh, But even though it seems right, and most of the engineering leaders I feel are very intelligent, they are well aware of the situation, and they know that this is probably the right thing to do. But why do you
yeah,
think there is a restriction or there is an apprehension towards not adopting such frameworks? I might be wrong here. This might be an assumption, but I have
yeah.
talked to a lot of them. But there is some level of apprehension I feel in the engineering leaders usually, that they don't move towards this. What do you think could be the reason here?
Well, I had a luxury to implement or to help with the advisory implementing, this sort of data-driven approach checks when it comes to the teams in a couple of different companies. Most of the time, this sort of pushback or rejections comes from the fact that we don't want to treat our people as numbers, if you know what I mean. So usually that's the number one thing that I'm hearing, and the second
Yeah,
thing is that you know data is just part of the song, part of the story, which is absolutely right. And here the important distinction is we were talking previously, about extremes, which is either you have the gut feeling based teams or the data
yeah,
driven teams. Of course, the combination of both is that's the biggest wow factor that you can obtain. Speaking very openly, I treat these numbers not as goals, but rather as aspirations or indicators. That's the right word, in my opinion. Because, to be very specific, you might be having a person with the high amount of pull requests, or opposite to that, and you might be saying like, this is the right developer. Opposite to that, you might have a person with a very low to zero number of pull requests, but it doesn't mean that that person is low performing, because instead of individually contributing to the code, he might be doing mentoring and code pairing and doing some more programming, which has a much higher aspects or
absolutely.
impact compared to the metrics that we are using. So there has to be always some reasoning why and some connotation. So yeah, the thing is that we shouldn't be using these numbers, some definitive metrics, whether the team is highly performing or not. There is always some sort of context into that has to be added there. Yeah,
Right, right. Perfect. I think well answered there. I
yeah,
get your point. Cool. Let's move on to something more interesting here.
okay,
There are different metrics which each
yeah,
team has to look at different scenarios, right?
mm-hmm.
Like when you talk about like cycle time, how many lines of code somebody has written, or how many commits somebody has done. There are different metrics that you can look at. I mean, there are 20s of them.
Yeah,
Prominent framework is around Dora and space, but let's say if we are choosing to work on something in a team, there are a few metrics that one should look at, right?
mm-hmm.
So how do you choose those metrics? How do you
Mm-hmm.
choose which ones to really look at?
Okay. Yeah, exactly as you are saying, COVID, the basket from which we can choose is pretty broad.
Yeah.
Here we speak about dozens to almost 100 of different indicators that we might find useful. Before I start diving into specifics, let's uncover some of the principles that I'm trying to stick to before advising specific indicators to which to lean to, right? So to me, the number one thing is that, as I was saying, these numbers are just indicators. So it shouldn't be tied to some sort of any performance reviews or efficiency of the teams and these sort of things, because it's dangerous. The people will game it anyway, right? If you put it like this, right? So it shouldn't be tied to any bonuses or compensation metrics or whatever. That's a way to help, basically. The second thing that, and I'm pretty radical here, is that I don't want to see the data being used for the purpose of measuring the efficiency of an individual as a developer, right? So, to me, the lowest granularity that I'm looking at is the team itself, right? Since the moment you are starting to look into individuals, it's a dangerous game. Of course, we might be having some underperformer in the team. That's what I'm hearing as an excuse why to have it. But in that case, I would rather see the team to deal with that situation on their own, as opposed to teaching them to wait until a manager comes and makes the resolution. So to me, the notion of self-healing teams is something that is really important. Of course, I might be having a look into specific data about some individual, but I would still be very strict in making sure that it is the team itself that makes that ultimate decision without using the data, right? Because to be honest, people already in the team know who's sort of performing, not performing very well, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the second thing. So again, looking at the efficiency or productivity metrics from the perspective of the whole department, the divisions, tribes, chapters, however we call it, up to specific teams, that's absolutely fine. But I would be strictly against using it for individuals on the individual level, right? The one thing that I learned is that we shouldn't be diving too deep into how the sprints work, what's on the plate, what's the velocity of the teams, and so on and so forth, because usually it's either it's counterintuitive, but it's not as important as, for example, how big of a focus the teams can have and handle, or how much of importance the initiatives that we are throwing to the teams are, right? So basically it's more about making sure that the discovery process works right first and foremost, and only then we can have a look into the efficiency of the teams. So usually the story is like a company is inviting me to do some internal audit and saying openly, my teams are not working very well, I don't have trust in my teams, please have a look. Usually, doing the deep dive in the teams themselves, usually they work pretty well, and of course we can fine tune some of the things and increase their efficiency by, I would say, 10 to 15%, right? Might be to 30%, which is quite ambitious already. But the gem lies somewhere else, and it's about the discovery, what we are throwing to the teams, what's on their plate. And the second thing which I learned is to create synergies. Being more specific, it's more about synergies between, for example, an engineering manager of a team and their product manager. If you create a synergy and the fit and the chemistry between the two, then all of a sudden your productivity might get increased by 300%. So that's yet another message, not looking too much into the data and creating this synergy in between and the chemistry. That's what's really like boosting the efficiency like hell. Yeah. So being more specific, usually what I would advise is first and foremost, making sure that we are working on the right things, meaning seeing what's for example, the adoption rate. That's how I call it. That being said, I want to see that most of the releases and the features that we offer are well accepted by the final customer, right? So what's their satisfaction? And I want to see that, for example, we are working that I would say about 65% adoption rate. That being said, of course, we can't ask for 100% because that means we don't allow any mistakes and no psychological safety. And basically we end up copying the work of the competitors, which is a nightmare to do, right? So that is one thing. The second thing is I want to make sure that my teams are working or have enough capacity to work on the things that matter the most, meaning the roadmap. So I call it a roadmap contribution. If we have, for example, product engineering teams working on the product, then I expect to have this number around 60 to 80%, right? That being said, most of the time, I want to see my teams working on the product roadmap, right? We might have some technical roadmap, or usually people are forgetting about the off-roadmap items, which is business as usual. And usually you would be surprised if you start measuring the roadmap contribution, you might find out that some of your teams are spending 55% off roadmap, right? Which is sort of alarming, right? So you know where your focus should be. And that's already a pretty good indicator to start with, right? So the roadmap contribution is number one thing. The second thing is usually what I see is that if we are on sprints, then we want to fix, for example, the trust towards the teams. That being said, you know, if you're on sprints, as I was saying, I want to see that we deliver at least 80% of the sprint, as I was saying before. That be, you know, with the number of the tickets in the sprint itself, right? So that's basically, you know, the amount of the planned tickets versus the amount of the tickets being delivered in the very same sprint, with no move over to the next sprint and again at the carryovers, right? So that's yet another thing. And basically this way the teams are getting trust and build the trust on their own. And moving this number from, let's say, 50% to 80% is already a big achievement, right? Again, we don't want to have 100% because it's estimates. It's not like some sort of commitments, right? The other thing that I might be saying is sort of exceptional that I'm measuring is, I call it epic cycle time. So what I mean here is that usually, you know, Jira and all the tools, they are great at measuring the cycle time on the level of the tasks and these sort of minor things, which are not really important. I want to see that the epics, the milestones and the increments as they are being deployed to the product are deployed on a regular basis, and the deployment frequency is roughly around a month. In my definition, or in my view, in my book, the definition of the epic is that the epic should deliver a tangible value to the customer, right? So it shouldn't be some simple user story. It should be something really tangible as an increment. And I really want to see the teams sticking to deliver on average one epic per month, right? So we are talking basically about the art of vertical slicing here, to be honest, right? And the reason why it's important is that usually you don't want to see the teams that go dark for 3 to 4 months, then they move to, you know, they go back from the dark ages after a couple of months, and they want to, you know, get celebrated because they achieved something very big, but the product manager says it was not what they meant. The stakeholder is sort of angry at seeing what they produced. Then there's a bunch of endless bunch of bugs for another 3 weeks. We all experienced, you know, this situation, and that's something we want to avoid. We don't speak about anything unique here. It's nothing more than the feedback loop and the frequency, or, you know, the rapidity of the feedback loop. So we are in the principle of agility. Agility is nothing more than, you know, the speed of the feedback loop, basically. You can forget these hundreds of or thousands of books about agility. It's nothing more than that, right? And this allows the teams to steer and to just, you know, stick back to the roadmap, basically, right? So you know, and of course we can speak about the DORA metrics, the deployment frequency, change failure rate, and so on and so forth, the usual, or the space metrics. That's already fine. I know I'm speaking for too long. Nevertheless, there is one tiny metric or indicator that I want to add here. And I was pretty surprised how greatly it helps. And that's the, you know, satisfaction or employee NPS score, basically, where you're looking at the productivity. And, you know, there's quite a lot of tools that offer you this sort of functionality where you can measure, you know, what's the satisfaction of the teams, what's their cooperation, what's the mood, what's the wellness score, what's the relationship when it comes to their peers, to their team, or to their manager. And the reason why I'm talking about it is that I was literally surprised how much it has helped me to save some of the teams, as opposed to see the teams rotting and not handling certain situations well. If I may put a specific story here, is that I might see that in one specific team or specific department, the communication goes down quite rapidly, or the relationship score goes down quite rapidly. So that gives me a hint that, I'm coming to an engineering manager and ask him, if you run the next one-to-ones, then please ask your teams about this specific thing and come
Yes.
back to me with what's going on. And most of the time, people say how things are if the culture is good enough and with no intrigues, and they are open to share their views. So you already have certain hints what's happening in the team and what your action might be, as opposed to not knowing anything about it, people being silent, your team being disassembled while not being aware of that, and you end up in a situation that you cannot basically save the team, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And you need to rebuild, which ends up, running yet another investment for half a year for usually rebuilding that team, right? A couple of months. And you can, when we speak about the budget, we all know that the biggest cost in software companies are developers, right? So speaking of the cost, that's a huge impact here. So basically what I was going to say or point to is that, again, that's the principle of prevention here that helps me quite significantly to make sure that we are still on the same spot and keeping the tendency high when it comes to the performance of the teams. Yeah. So hopefully that was a pretty deep list of what we can talk about.
No, I think that is much needed. I mean, I can't say even for a single point that you mentioned that I differ in the opinion. In fact, I'm more now concerned, and I want to go back to the same question that it seems so important. It looks very important to follow these things, be it your investment distribution, be it tracking your epic cycle time, which was a very interesting piece, by the way. Like people track the PR cycle time or small things. Tracking the time to delivery of the value is something that one should track. Of course, you can break it and then track individual pieces to optimize different pieces. But yeah, it is very important to track that. So each and every point seems so interesting and so important for an engineering leader or an engineering manager, like imbibe in the team from the very beginning itself. I still find that adoption of such things is very hard right now. Like people struggle to adopt these things. Any piece of advice on that? Because right now when you are talking to teams, you would have also felt that. What exactly do you think you do that people start looking at it as an important thing to do, as a responsibility, or as one important thing engineering leadership should be doing?
Yeah, that's a really good topic to uncover, because if we don't run the adoption of these, engineering efficiency metrics right, then we are not in a pretty situation. Usually what I'm saying when I'm advising, the companies how to adopt these sort of things is that, the numbers is just a third of the story. 2/3 are how we treat these numbers and to create the ecosystem around these numbers, right? If you just, throw the reports on the teams and the numbers, it doesn't provide much of a value, right? So speaking of the adoption here, COVID is, again, we can start from the way how, to motivate people and explaining them the reasoning behind it, right? So what's our motivation, why we want to introduce this sort of efficiency indicators and so on and so forth. And basically to articulate and over-communicate the message, what's the reason why. That being said, I'm always and constantly talking about the principle, we don't want to, look at you as a number. That is number one thing and the number one worry we have. And the principles are, we want to be transparent and we want to be preventive, right? So these are the two utmost principles that I'm looking for. And I'm telling them and explaining that to the teams and to the people via using stories. What happened to me when I had no luxury of looking into specific data, right?
Right.
So that is number one thing. The second thing is that, of course, this thing shouldn't be just run top down. it should be run from the very beginning with some sort of a tiger team around and making sure that you choose the right people and you invite them to run these conversations bottom up, right? So you can start with specific engineering managers, engineering directors, tribe leaders, chapter leaders, whatever you have. And there are people who are actually interested in being better leaders. And they are usually the people who raise their hands up and sign up for that, right? So having these people on board from early on stage, that's really vital, because if you just throw it to them top down, it doesn't help very well, right? So these are the two, I would say, most important thing. And of course, there has to be some, I would say, activation and adoption period. The activation is, how you start running it. And the second thing, the adoption itself is, it's not just about, here are the reports and please deal with it. It's mostly about, let's run some sort of a continuous workshop about what these numbers mean. What are the situations where they can help you actually identifying certain, inefficiency, potential factors, right? And also giving them the ability to provide some sort of a feedback and say, for example, this specific indicator doesn't make sense, or we don't measure it well because, for example, being very specific, the deployment frequency might be measured in different ways, or the cycle time might be defined in a different ways depending on what stages in the cell we are considering or not. So these are all the different things that we might be able to consider. A good example of that is again talking about the cycle time. I wouldn't punish the teams in the B2B sector, for example, of course, because their cycle time might be too long and up to the deployment. So there is always a question whether, to include the deployment phase into the cycle time or not. Because if you are deploying just, in the B2B world once per half year, then obviously, this sort of metric doesn't make sense for you, right? So that's just one of the examples, right? And talking about the adoption itself, I would say the most important thing that I found out also was to make sure that you provide some guidelines in a written way into your knowledge base about what specific numbers mean, why we are measuring those, including some how-to guidelines, meaning like what are the thresholds, and if you are in red numbers, what might be the right things to starting to look at. Your focus might be totally broken, or you are running too many initiatives in parallel at the same time, or you are having too many ad hocs, disturbing your sprint. So let's start measuring these, or these sort of how-to manuals. They're really great because from that moment on, people can point their finger on to what's the definition of that measure. But again, trying to be smart, and every person has a different explanation of how these things are measured. So again, having specific formulas, the motivation there, what's next, what's wait for us, and some sort of how-to manuals, that's really helpful, right? And the last thing to say, part of these manuals or these guidelines, there should be some sort of as I was saying, the ecosystem around. That being said, for example, I want to make sure that an engineering manager, as a first level manager person, is responsible for these specific metrics and should be looking on these metrics, let's say, on bi-weekly basis. The director or the VP person should be looking on other metrics on department level, I would say once per month or something similar to that. And making these sort of measures part of your daily routine, that's really important. And ensuring that we are talking about these numbers on our dailies, on our one-on-ones, just checking whether the health check is fine or not, and eventually trying to basically distill some situation and moving the teams back on track when some of the indicators might be not showing the best performance ever in the team, right? So these are just a couple of things that I'm really paying attention to when it comes to the adoption itself, and as opposed just to throwing the numbers on the teams and please deal with that. It never works. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense.
Perfect. I think couldn't have asked for more. One of the most interesting sessions for me personally to learn from you and see how things being done. Great, man. I think I would love to have you one more time on the show talking about
Okay.
specific use cases where we can spread more knowledge around these topics to our audience. I think that would
Yeah.
be really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, COVID, and it was a
Cheers,
pleasure to have
man.
you. So enjoy. Bye.